There are a lot of gruesome ways to die in space. You could be fried to a crisp thanks to the unfiltered rays of the burning hot sun. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you could freeze to death in the chilling vacuum of space. Or your ship could suddenly depressurize and you could be killed in the resulting explosion. Science fiction stories have taken this already cruel environment and made it so much worse. For instance, you could come across an alien creature that attaches itself to your face and plants its young in your body, where it incubates for a while and then dramatically bursts out of your chest. Or your ship's AI could go on a murderous rampage, perhaps giving you a little shove while you're outside doing work on the ship, sending you flying off into the void in your secure spacesuit, where you'll eventually run out of oxygen and suffocate. Let's dig into why horror stories set in space are so effective. While there are of course many video games and novels that fall into the category of space horror, this video is going to focus on films and TV shows. With so many horrible ways to die in the inky blackness of space, it may seem obvious that it's a good setting for horror stories. But back in 2021, journalist Elle Hunt declared that, quote, "horror cannot be set in space," end quote. This is because, in her eyes, the setting necessarily makes it science fiction rather than horror. To her, quote, "horror is predicated on the fear of the other, the unfamiliar in the world as we know it. Space, we already don't know it," end quote. The idea that stories can't fall into more than one genre is obviously flawed, but I think Hunt is forcing this for a hypothetical interrogation of space horror. The more egregious issue with Hunt's argument is that horror is predicated on the fear of the other. While I think this is often true, I don't think it's a requirement of the genre. There are plenty of films set in largely unfamiliar environments that count as horror. Take, for instance, the winding cave system that's explored in The Descent. While there are some people out there who enjoy spelunking, most people watching the film won't have experienced such an environment. Or how about horror that occurs in fantasy locations, like in Pan's Labyrinth, which is only partly set in the real world? The scene where Ophelia ventures into the lair of the Pale Man and then foolishly wakes him up isn't at all familiar, but it's still terrifying. Really, the only requirement for something to be called horror is for it to inspire fear, something which films set in space are definitely capable of. Taking the complete opposite stance to Hunt is another writer, Emily Hughes, who at the start of 2023 declared that actually every space story is a horror story. She writes that, quote, "even space stories that purport to be neutral or optimistic have horrifying elements just by virtue of their setting," end quote. In Star Wars, for example, she points out that there's all manner of dangerous creature waiting to gobble our heroes up, as well as plenty of human-on-human killing, from the brutal murder of younglings to the destruction of an entire planet. Hughes goes on to write that, quote, "even in Star Trek, that most optimistic of sci-fi properties, Starfleet officers and crew are constantly dodging one gruesome fate after another. The very fact that red shirts has become synonymous with cannon fodder should be indicative that Star Trek is a lot more horrifying than it lets on," end quote. While I can see the point that Hughes is making, no one would really place Star Trek and Star Wars in the horror genre. There's a huge difference between the largely non-gory deaths on show and their overall lighter tone compared to the oppressive tension and scares that are provided by horror movies. There are a number of films set in space that do have true moments of horror, but they don't linger there long enough to become actual horror films. One example of this is Interstellar. In one such horrifying scene, our spacefaring characters wind up on a seemingly safe ocean planet, only for them to realise that the mountains in the distance are actually gigantic waves that are rapidly approaching and will soon sweep them to their watery deaths. And Gravity is arguably terrifying for the vast majority of its runtime. As soon as the debris hits our pair of astronauts in their shuttle, the film becomes an intense psychological survival thriller. It's not pushed quite into the realm of horror, but the film definitely taps into fears of the vastness of space, of isolation, and of a lack of oxygen. So let's move on to space films that clearly sit within the horror genre. Alien is perhaps the definitive space horror film. From the cramped and grimy interior of the Nostromo to the various creepy designs of the xenomorph throughout its life cycle, Alien oozes tension and terror, and hits upon many of the key things that make space horror so effective. Horror academic Steve Jones says that, quote, "space is frightening because it differs from our usual experiences. For example, the lack of atmosphere and gravity reverse the most fundamental aspects of our experiences on Earth. At the same time, and this is crucial, one can imagine what it would be like to be in space. It is close enough to our experiences on Earth that it is conceivable. Even though few of us have experienced zero gravity, most of us have had the somewhat comparable experience of floating in water. It is this blend of the conceivable with the unfamiliar that is so intrinsically unsettling." End quote. Alien really nails this blend between the familiar and the unfamiliar. The lived-in look of the spaceship adds a sheen of reality to everything, as does the crew essentially being blue-collar workers, rather than intrepid space explorers. It's still sci-fi, but it doesn't feel too far removed from our current reality. Aside from the winding and dark corridors of the Nostromo, Alien taps into the fear of being so far away from the safety of civilization. As the film's tagline puts it, in space, no one can hear you scream. The sense of extreme isolation permeates the film. There's a feeling that help is completely out of reach. This is a massive part of what sets space horror apart from other horror movies. In slasher films, there's a feeling that you can outrun the killer, fight back, or that a police officer will come to your aid. This sense that help is out there and that it's attainable carries over into most horror movies. Regan's possession in The Exorcist, for example, is undeniably horrific, and the film is incredibly tense, but she isn't on her own, as her mother gets an exorcist in to help. Although these sources of help don't always turn out to be the most effective against the killer, demon, or ghost, that they're a possible avenue to explore adds some degree of comfort. But getting help just isn't possible in most horror movies set in space, which amps up the feeling of isolation. Tied into this idea is also the fact that escape often feels possible in horror movies. The horror is usually confined within a specific boundary, and if the character can just run out of the woods or leave the haunted house, all will be well. But out in space, often light years from civilization, there isn't anywhere to run to. Characters are confined to a spaceship, and stepping outside will just lead to a quick death. There's a terrifying juxtaposition between drifting through the unimaginable enormity of space and being trapped in a comparatively tiny spaceship. As well as posing practical problems, the unendingness of space and the confinement of spacecrafts come with psychological issues. This is shown to great effect in Moon, which follows a lone man working at a station on the moon. These psychological challenges are a real problem for astronauts and are currently being tackled by space agencies. Frequent communication with family and access to therapists has long been provided, but agencies are currently looking into ways of making long-term missions more bearable. Some possibilities include having astronauts tend a garden to boost their morale, and using virtual reality to make necessary exercising feel more immersive and therefore more enjoyable. But these things often aren't available in sci-fi films, allowing isolation, depression, and existential dread to creep in and get real comfy in people's minds. Not that they helped keep Sam sane in Moon anyway. While everything I've discussed so far is part of what makes horror in space so scary, I've not touched on the main thing, that being whatever the alien creature or weird sci-fi phenomenon is. See, it's not just the fear of the unknown that makes space horror so scary. It's that fear being realised by encountering something utterly inhuman that we don't understand and therefore aren't equipped to deal with. In horror movies about slashers, ghosts, vampires, werewolves, or zombies, there's a framework to work off of. Often characters have at least a rough idea of what's going on, or can take a guess at how to deal with it. If you're up against a vampire, then you can at least try garlic, sunlight, and crosses. But that isn't available when you're encountering a totally new creature. As a result, space horror can feel surprising, creative, and unique. In Alien, the xenomorphs feel like perfectly engineered predators. Early designs of the alien aren't exactly nightmare-inducing, but then Dan O'Bannon, the film's writer, suggested that director Ridley Scott check out the artwork of H.R. Giger, and he knew instantly that Giger's designs were right for the film. The xenomorph that made it to screen feels truly alien. They seem to be part insect, part reptile, part human, part machine. They feel designed to be dangerous. They're completely black, so can easily hide in the shadows. They have acid blood and hard-to-crack exoskeletons, and they're smart, really smart.
They cut the power.
What do you mean they cut the power? How could they cut the power, man? They're animals.
Life also sees humans come into contact with an extraterrestrial, but it doesn't initially seem dangerous. When first found, the crew think it's just a single-cell organism, but it quickly grows. Named Calvin, the creature seems curious and only becomes hostile when it loses consciousness and is then revived via electroshock. Calvin is also very intelligent, but he's also highly adaptable, making it a formidable foe. The situation also isn't helped by the astronauts making a series of incredibly stupid decisions, like breaking quarantine and using a flamethrower aboard the International Space Station. Of course, not all space horror slots into the creature feature category. Event Horizon, for example, is essentially Lovecraftian cosmic horror. We follow a crew who investigate a lost ship that has suddenly reappeared. Once aboard, they find the remnants of carnage, but they also begin to experience creepy hallucinations. Spoiler alert, it's revealed that the ship travels to a hellish dimension outside the known universe. While in this dimension, the ship essentially gains sentience and is now possessed, with the crew also becoming possessed. We have no idea what lurks in this other dimension, but the hints that we get show just enough to inspire true terror.
What happened to your eyes?
Where we're going, we won't need eyes to see.
Pandorum follows a relatively similar path of exploring madness in space. It's set aboard an Ark ship carrying the last remnants of humanity to a distant Earth-like planet. 2 crew members unexpectedly wake up during the journey and find that dangerous cannibalistic humanoid creatures are roaming the ship. But worse than that is the looming threat posed by a deep space sickness called Pandorum, which causes psychosis and hallucinations. Unfamiliar illness is also the focus of The Silent Sea, which is largely set on the moon. A crew is sent to retrieve an important sample from a lunar station where things went mysteriously wrong. Spoiler alert again, once there they discover a water-like substance that multiplies rapidly when it comes into contact with living cells. People who are infected by the watery virus are essentially drowned from the inside out. It's absolutely brutal. It's this creativity in regard to the unfamiliar that makes space horror so effective. Such films explore the mystery of what's out there, and because it's necessarily non-human, there's plenty of room to get creative and weird. We basically know what we're getting when we switch on a slasher or a ghost film, but with space horror, it feels like anything could happen. Paired with this creativity and uniqueness is the fact that all space horror films tap into some of our most primal fears, namely isolation, the dark, and lack of oxygen. Obviously, not all space horror films are hits. Life is basically just a less good version of Alien, and I'd imagine it's a one and done type of movie for a lot of people. And then there's Jason X, which sees iconic slasher Jason Voorhees being resurrected aboard a futuristic spaceship, and he then of course slaughters the crew. It's as ridiculous as it sounds, and to me falls into the so bad it's good category.
Guys! It's okay, he just wanted his machete back! Whew!
But at least it's not boring, like Europa Report sadly was. It has a great concept, being a realistic take on a crew going to explore possible alien life on one of Jupiter's moons, but sadly it just drags on. But these movies failing to reach their full potential doesn't take away from the fact that space is a fantastic setting for horror. The possibilities for horrifying creatures and concepts in space are endless, just like space itself. Thanks for watching, and remember, if you come across a weird alien egg, don't get all up in its grill.